Welcome to Philosophy for Lunch. I'm Sean Spainhour.
And I'm Claire Spainhour. This is a show about ideas, the kind that actually matter, the kind that show up in your life whether or not you have a name for them.
Every episode, we take one idea, one thinker, or one question, and we work through it together. Not as experts delivering a lecture, as two people genuinely thinking out loud. We disagree sometimes. We get lost sometimes. We find our way back.
The episodes run 25 to 35 minutes. Long enough to go somewhere real, short enough to fit a lunch break, a commute, or 10 minutes before the day starts pulling at you.
If you have ever wanted to understand what philosophy is actually for, not as a university subject, not as a set of names and dates to memorize, but as a way of thinking more carefully about being alive, this show is for you.
This is episode 1, and it felt right to start with a question that is not ancient or abstract. It is happening inside your mind right now, and it has been since you were a child. Today, we are talking about Anna Freud and the hidden logic of the ways our minds protect us from ourselves.
Philosophy for lunch. Let's go. Here is something that happened to me last week. Someone cut me off in a parking lot. Just completely, aggressively, unnecessarily cut me off. And for a split second, I was furious. Full on, hands gripping the wheel furious. And then, almost immediately, I thought, you know what? That person is probably having a terrible day. They are probably exhausted. Maybe there is an emergency. They did not mean it personally.
And did that actually make you feel better?
Completely. Gone. Problem solved. I was magnanimous, generous, practically saintly.
Okay, so here's the question I want to put to you. Were you actually being generous, or were you doing something else? Something that looked like generosity, but was really just your mind protecting you from sitting with the anger?
And that right there is what today's episode is about.
Anna Freud, defense mechanisms, and the hidden logic behind the ways our minds refuse to feel certain things.
Big ideas, human conversations, 25 minutes. This is Philosophy for Lunch. I want to start with Anna Freud as a person, because she tends to get swallowed by her father's shadow. When people hear Freud, they think Sigmund, and Sigmund is enormous. You cannot overstate his influence on how we think about the mind.
Even if a lot of what he specifically said turned out to be wrong?
Yes, even accounting for that. But Anna is her own thinker, and in some ways, her contributions are more durable than his. She was born in 1895, the youngest of Sigmund's 6 children, and she is the only one of those children who became a psychoanalyst herself. Which is interesting on its own. She chose to enter her father's world, and then she built something genuinely new inside it.
There is a somewhat complicated personal dimension there that is worth acknowledging. Sigmund analyzed Anna himself, his own daughter, which is, by any modern standard, deeply problematic.
To put it gently, it would be considered an ethical violation today. You do not analyze family members. The therapeutic relationship requires a certain kind of distance, and that distance is structurally impossible with your own child.
But we are not here to litigate that. The point is that Anna went through it, emerged from it, and spent her career building something that was genuinely her own. Her most important work is a book published in 1936 called The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. This is where she lays out the framework we are going to spend most of this episode exploring. But before we get into the mechanisms themselves, I want to make sure we have the basic map of the mind she is working with.
Freudian territory.
Freudian territory. So in the model that Anna inherited and then refined, you have 3 structures. The id is the raw, primitive, instinctual part of us. The part that wants things immediately, that has no concept of consequences or social norms. Pure want, pure drive. Then you have the superego, which is the internalized voice of authority. Your parents, your culture, your moral framework. The part of you that says, you should not want that. You ought to be better than that. Then the ego is the mediator. The part of the psyche that has to negotiate between what the ID demands and what the superego will permit.
The 2-year-old inside all of us, the disapproving parent inside all of us, and the exhausted adult trying to manage them both.
That is actually a very good summary. And Anna's central insight was that the ego does not just negotiate. It also protects itself. It develops strategies, largely unconscious strategies, for managing the anxiety that gets created when the id and the superego are in conflict. And those strategies are the defense mechanisms.
So before Anna, the thinking was mostly focused on what the id wanted and what the superego prohibited. Anna shifted attention to the ego itself, to the machinery the mind uses to keep itself stable under pressure. That shift is what makes her work so practically useful. It is not just a theory of desire or a theory of guilt. It is a theory of how the mind manages the gap between them.
And because that gap is universal, because everyone has impulses they cannot fully act on, and everyone has a conscience that generates anxiety, defense mechanisms are not pathological. They are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are signs that you are a functioning human being with a psyche that is doing its job. Let us slow down on what a defense mechanism actually is, because the phrase gets used constantly in everyday conversation, and I do not think people always know precisely what they mean by it.
It has become pop psychology's shorthand for, I do not want to deal with that.
Which is in the neighborhood of the truth, but not quite it. A defense mechanism in Anna Freud's framework is a specific, largely unconscious mental operation that the ego uses to reduce anxiety. The key words are unconscious and reduce anxiety. Not avoid reality, though some mechanisms do involve distorting reality. The goal is to protect the self from feeling something it judges to be unbearable. And critically, defense mechanisms operate without your awareness. That is not incidental to the definition that is the definition. If you knew you were doing it, it would not be a defense mechanism in the technical sense. It would just be a choice.
Which raises an immediate philosophical question we will come back to. If you do not know you are doing it, in what sense are you doing it at all?
Exactly. But let us first understand the mechanisms themselves, and then we can get into what they mean.
Anna Freud considered repression to be the most fundamental mechanism. Walk us through that one first.
Repression is the process by which the ego pushes unacceptable thoughts, feelings, memories, or impulses below the threshold of conscious awareness. The content does not disappear. It gets stored somewhere inaccessible to ordinary introspection. And Freud used a hydraulic metaphor that I think is genuinely useful. Repressed material is like pressurized content. It does not go away because you have pushed it below the surface. It requires continuous psychic energy to keep it there. And it finds other ways to express itself in dreams, in slips of the tongue, in inexplicable emotional reactions, in the things you find yourself drawn to or repelled by without being able to explain why.
The famous Freudian slip. You say, I love this dinner.
Right. Something leaks through. The pressure finds a crack. And what makes repression so strange is that you cannot catch yourself doing it, almost by definition. If you become aware that you are avoiding thinking about something, that awareness itself means the repression has partially failed. The successful operation is invisible.
Which is genuinely unsettling when you sit with it. The idea that there may be entire categories of your own inner life that you have no access to, not because you are choosing to ignore them, but because a part of your own mind has placed them behind a door and is actively guarding it.
And that part of your mind genuinely believes it is helping you. That is the key thing. Defense mechanisms are not self-sabotage in any simple sense. They're the ego's attempt to keep you functional, to keep you from being overwhelmed. The problem only arises when they become rigid, when you use the same mechanisms over and over, when they start costing more than they protect you from.
Anna Freud identified about 10 major mechanisms. Let us walk through the ones that I think are most recognizable in daily life.
Let us start with projection, because I think it is the one that causes the most interpersonal damage and the least self-awareness in the people using it.
Projection is when feelings or impulses that are unacceptable to the self get attributed to someone else. Instead of recognizing, I am angry at this person, you experience them as angry at you. Instead of recognizing, I am jealous, you become convinced the other person is jealous of you. You move the feeling outside of yourself and place it on someone else.
And the maddening thing about projection is that it can look exactly like accurate perception, like you are simply reading the room. I can tell you are angry with me, but what you are actually doing is externalizing your own inner state and then experiencing it as though it is coming from outside. The terrifying version of this, when it becomes severe, is paranoia the world feels threatening, because you have placed your own hostile impulses into everyone around you.
The milder everyday version is probably something like, I am in a bad mood, and I become convinced that everyone around me seems cold today. The coldness is mine. I have put it out there.
Reaction formation is related, and I think equally common. This is when an unacceptable impulse gets converted into its opposite. If I have aggressive feelings towards someone I love, and that love makes the aggression feel morally intolerable, I might become excessively solicitous toward them, performatively warm, almost suffocatingly caring. The aggression is still there. It has just been flipped.
Or the person who desperately wants something and cannot allow themselves to acknowledge that wanting, and so they become loudly dismissive of it. I do not care about money at all. And then every decision they make is organized around acquiring money. The protest is the tell.
Shakespeare got at this with, "The lady doth protest too much." The excess of the denial is itself the evidence of the underlying feeling. Now let us do rationalization, because I suspect this one is the most universally practiced.
Rationalization is when you construct a logical-sounding justification for a decision you have already made for reasons that have nothing to do with the justification you are offering. The decision came first. The reason came second. And the reason is invented after the fact to make you feel acceptable to yourself.
The philosopher Jonathan Haidt, in his work on moral psychology, describes this as the social intuitionist model. His argument is that moral intuition comes first, we have an immediate gut reaction, and moral reasoning comes second, as a kind of press secretary. The press secretary's job is not to discover the truth. The press secretary's job is to make the principle look good. We decide, and then we explain. The explanation is post hoc narration, not causal reasoning.
And once you see that, you start seeing it everywhere. Why I bought the thing I did not need, why I did not apologize when I clearly should have, why I did not apply for the job. There is always a reason. The reason sounds reasonable, and we have mostly forgotten if we ever knew that the reason was constructed to justify something that had already been decided on other grounds entirely.
Two more, and then we move on to the philosophical questions. Sublimation and displacement.
Sublimation is considered the healthiest of the defense mechanisms. This is when an unacceptable impulse or feeling gets channeled into something socially acceptable or even socially valuable. Aggression becomes competitive sport, erotic energy becomes art, grief becomes music. The energy is real, the original target or expression is blocked, and so it finds another outlet that the ego and the superego can both live with.
There is a reason so much great art comes from pain. It is not a cliche, it is a description of a real psychological process. The feeling has to go somewhere. When it cannot go to its natural destination, it finds a door that is open. And sometimes what comes out of that door is extraordinary.
Displacement is related but distinct. Displacement is when a feeling gets redirected at a substitute target rather than sublimated into a different activity. The classic example: you are reprimanded by your boss, and you cannot express your anger at your boss. The professional and social costs are too high, so you come home and snap at your partner, or raise your voice at your kids, or kick the dog. The feeling is real. The target is wrong. The original feeling has been displaced onto someone who was not its source and does not deserve its force.
And displacement tends to travel downward through power hierarchies. You cannot direct the feeling at someone who has power over you, so you direct it at someone who does not. Which means the people with the least power in any system absorb a disproportionate amount of the displaced anger of the people above them. That is a deeply uncomfortable structural implication of a psychological insight.
You can see it in families, in workplaces, in the way political anger gets directed at convenient targets rather than actual sources. Displacement is not just a personal pathology. It scales. Now let us get into what all of this actually means. What are the philosophical implications of living with an unconscious that is actively shaping what you see, what you feel, and what you believe your reasons are?
The first question I want to put on the table is about self-knowledge. Western philosophy from Socrates forward has placed enormous emphasis on knowing yourself. The unexamined life is not worth living. The examined life is not only better, it is the precondition for living well at all. But what Anna Freud is describing is a mind that is systematically obscuring itself from itself. The mechanisms are unconscious by design. The awareness would defeat the purpose.
Which means you cannot examine what you cannot see. And a significant portion of what is driving your behavior, your emotional reactions, your choices may be structurally invisible to you.
The honest answer to how much of yourself you can actually know, given this framework, is partial. More partial than we want to believe. And I think part of what makes this uncomfortable is that we have such a powerful investment in the idea that we know ourselves, that we understand our own motivations, that the reasons we give for our actions are our actual reasons. If Anna Freud is right, a lot of that confidence is itself a kind of defense. The certainty that you know yourself is protecting you from the anxiety of not knowing.
I want to push back on something, though, because I do not want this to collapse into pure skepticism. Anna Freud herself did not think that. The whole point of psychoanalytic work, of therapeutic work, was that you could make the unconscious more conscious. Not completely, not perfectly, but meaningfully more than it was. The examined life is still the goal. The examination just has to be more honest about what it is up against.
Right. The goal is not total transparency that is probably not possible and arguably not even desirable. The goal is to be less at the mercy of your defenses, to have more choice about whether you deploy a mechanism rather than it running automatically without your participation.
The second philosophical question is about moral responsibility, because if a lot of what we do is being driven by unconscious mechanisms, if the reasons we give are not the real reasons, what does that do to our capacity to be held accountable?
This does not resolve cleanly, and I think it is worth sitting with the tension rather than papering over it. On one hand, you cannot be fully responsible for something you had no awareness of and no ability to choose. That is the logic behind concepts like diminished responsibility in law, and it has genuine philosophical weight. If your cruelty towards someone is the product of displaced anger you had no idea you were carrying, the moral picture is different than if you chose to be cruel.
On the other hand, I was unconsciously defended against that feeling can become an infinite excuse, a permanent escape hatch from accountability.
Which is exactly what Anna Freud would resist, because the point of understanding your defenses is not to be absolved by them, it is to gain more agency over them, to become more responsible, not less. The knowledge creates an obligation. Once you understand that your anger at your partner is likely displaced from your boss, you cannot just keep doing it. The insight is not an excuse. It is an invitation to behave differently.
Which is a very different frame from using psychological concepts as permanent get-out-of-jail-free cards. I cannot help it, that is just my personality. I cannot help it, that is just my attachment style. Those framings misuse the framework. Understanding is the beginning of agency, not a substitute for it.
The third question worth raising is whether the whole framework carries an implicit value judgment that we should interrogate. Because the Freudian tradition and the broader psychotherapy tradition that grew out of it does assume that more self-knowledge is better, that defended people are less fully alive than less defended people, that the examined life is superior to the unexamined one, and that assumption is worth questioning.
Because it tips easily into a kind of psychological perfectionism. The idea that if you are fully analyzed, fully integrated, fully conscious of every defense you run, you will become some kind of frictionless, transparent, authentic self, which does not describe any actual human being who has ever existed.
And there are serious philosophers who would push back on the Socratic imperative itself, who would argue that some opacity about yourself is not just inevitable, but valuable, that the self-examining, self-narrating, totally transparent person is not an ideal to aspire to, but a kind of fiction. That some of what makes human beings interesting, creative, surprising, generative, is precisely that we are not fully available to ourselves.
I think the honest position is somewhere in the middle. Defense mechanisms are real, they have real costs, and understanding them better is genuinely useful. But the goal is not to dismantle all your defenses and live in the full, unmediated flood of every impulse and feeling you have ever had. That is not liberation. That is dysregulation. The goal is to hold your defenses a little more lightly, to catch yourself a little more often, to have slightly more choice about when and how you deploy them.
Which is a modest, undramatic ambition. But I think modest, undramatic ambitions are usually the ones that are actually achievable.
Before we close, we want to spend a few minutes on some questions that came in ahead of the season premiere. We put out a call on social asking what people most wanted to know about Anna Freud and defense mechanisms, and the response was genuinely great. So let us dig in.
The first question comes from a listener who asks, is there a difference between a defense mechanism and just being in denial? They sound like the same thing to me.
Great question. Denial is actually one of the defense mechanisms Anna Freud identified, so in that sense, it is a specific instance of the broader category. But not all defense mechanisms involve denial. Sublimation, for example, does not deny anything. It redirects something. Rationalization does not deny a feeling. It creates a false explanation for a real behavior. So denial is one tool in the toolkit, but the toolkit is much larger than denial alone.
I would also add that in ordinary language, being in denial tends to imply a degree of conscious awareness that the person is refusing to engage with. Like, deep down they know, but they are choosing not to face it. Whereas Anna Freud's defense mechanisms are genuinely unconscious, the person is not choosing to avoid something they secretly know. The avoidance is happening below the level of choice entirely. That is the more radical claim.
Next question. Do defense mechanisms ever stop? Like, is there any point in your life where you just stop needing them?
The short answer is no, probably not. And I think Anna Freud would say that is fine. Defense mechanisms are not training wheels. They are not something you use until you are developed enough to live without them. They are a permanent feature of having a mind that has to navigate between what it wants, what it fears, and what is socially possible. The goal of therapeutic work, or of any serious project of self-knowledge, is not to eliminate defenses, but to make them more flexible, to have access to a wider range of responses, to not be stuck running the same 3 or 4 mechanisms in every situation, regardless of whether they are appropriate.
A person who never used any defense mechanisms would not be enlightened. They would be overwhelmed. The psyche needs some protection to function. The question is always, is this defense still serving you, or has it become a cage?
Next question, and this one I find really interesting. How do you tell the difference between genuine insight about yourself and just rationalizing your rationalizations? Like, isn't all self-reflection just more storytelling?
Honestly, that is a hard question, and I do not think there is a clean answer to it. There is a real philosophical problem lurking here, which is that the tool you are using to examine your defenses, your conscious mind, is itself part of the system that constructs the defenses. You are trying to see the thing you see there is an inherent limitation there.
But I do not think that means all self-reflection is equally valid or equally unreliable. Some evidence is better than other evidence. Patterns that emerge across time, across relationships, across different contexts, those are more trustworthy than one-off interpretations. Insights that come with a quality of recognition, oh, that is something I have been doing for years, tend to have more weight than insights that conveniently exonerate you. And the testimony of people who know you well and have no reason to flatter you is often more reliable than your own account.
There is a reason therapy involves another person. Not because the therapist has magical access to your unconscious, but because the presence of another mind, one that is not invested in maintaining your particular story about yourself, creates the conditions for noticing things you would not notice alone.
One more question. Anna Freud worked a lot with children. Does any of this apply differently to kids than to adults?
Yes, and this is actually one of the areas where Anna Freud's original contribution is most distinctive. Her clinical work was largely with children. She co-founded the Hampstead War Nurseries during World War II to care for children who had been separated from their parents, and she spent decades observing how children develop psychologically under stress. Her insight was that in children, the defenses are less consolidated, less automatic, more visible. You can watch a child shift from one mechanism to another in real time in a way that is harder to observe in adults, where the mechanisms have become more deeply embedded and more automatic.
Which suggests something important. The defenses we rely on most heavily as adults are often ones that were formed early, under pressures that may no longer exist. A child who learned to use intellectualization retreating into abstract reasoning whenever emotional situations became threatening did so for a reason that made sense at the time. The adult who still uses intellectualization in every emotionally charged conversation may be running a very old program that was written for a very different environment.
The defense that protected you then may be the thing that limits you now. That is not a comfortable thought, but it is a useful one.
One thing I want to add to that, because I think it is underappreciated. Anna Freud was not just a theorist. She was a clinician who spent her career in direct contact with children and families under genuine duress. The Hampstead War Nurseries were not an academic exercise. These were real children, separated from their parents during wartime, and she and Dorothy Burlingham observed and documented their development with extraordinary care. What she found was that separation from a primary attachment figure was often more psychologically damaging to children than the external dangers of war, including bombing. A child who stayed with its mother in a bombed city often fared better psychologically than a child evacuated to safety without her. The attachment mattered more than the danger.
Which is a striking finding, and it connects to the defense mechanism work because what those children were doing, the ones who were separated and trying to cope, was developing defenses in real time under conditions of acute stress. You could watch the mechanisms form. That clinical observation is part of what gives her theoretical framework. It's grounding. It is not just armchair philosophy. It is observations made at the bedside, in the shelter, in the consulting room.
A final question before we close, and this one feels personal in a useful way. How do you actually work on your defenses without therapy? Is that even possible?
I want to be honest that therapy is genuinely valuable, and if it is accessible to you, it is worth taking seriously. The point Anna Freud made about needing another mind, another set of eyes on your patterns is a real one. There are things you cannot see about yourself that someone else can see relatively easily. That is not a defect. It is just how self-knowledge works.
That said, there is meaningful work you can do outside of a clinical relationship. Journaling, done seriously not as a feelings dump, but as genuine inquiry. Asking why did I react that way rather than just what happened can surface patterns over time. Close relationships with people who are honest with you and who you trust are probably the most important resource most people have. And there is a kind of reflective practice, which some philosophical traditions, including Stoicism, would recognize, of regularly pausing to ask, what am I actually feeling right now? And is my explanation for why I feel it the real one? Not in a self-punishing way. Just as a genuine question you leave open rather than closing immediately with the most comfortable answer.
The willingness to tolerate not knowing your own reasons for a little while, rather than rushing to a comfortable explanation. That tolerance for uncertainty about yourself is probably the core skill. And it is genuinely difficult. The mind wants resolution. It wants a story that makes sense. Defense mechanisms exist precisely because uncertainty and the raw feeling underneath it are so hard to sit with. Learning to sit with them a little longer, a little more honestly, is the practice. I want to come back to my parking lot story, because I have been thinking about it throughout this whole conversation. And the honest answer is, I do not know what I was doing in that moment. I genuinely cannot tell you whether the quick pivot to, they must be having a terrible day, was genuine empathy or rationalization, or something like reaction formation, the anger flipped into its opposite. The anger was real. What came after it, I am less sure about.
And I think that is actually the right place to land. Not, I figured it out, but I am now asking the question. Because that is what Anna Freud would want from us. Not total self-knowledge, which she never promised anyone, but a little more curiosity about the gap between what we feel and what we tell ourselves we feel. A little more willingness to look at the seams.
Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, Anna Freud might add. And the examination has to include the parts of your mind that do not particularly want to be examined. The parts that have been doing invisible work for years. Quietly keeping you stable, quietly keeping you from feeling things you decided long ago you could not afford to feel.
Which is harder than it sounds, and considerably more interesting, because those are the parts where, if you can get to them, the most meaningful change becomes possible. Not change in the sense of becoming a different person, but change in the sense of being more fully the person you already are, less defended against yourself, more present to your own life.
Anna Freud spent her career trying to help people do that. Working mostly with children, working through 2 world wars, working in a tradition that was often poorly understood and sometimes actively attacked. She did not promise transformation. She promised something quieter, a little more light in the corners where the mind does its hidden work. That seems worth the trouble. Next week, Marcus Aurelius, not the emperor, the anxious person writing to himself before dawn. What the Stoics actually believed about fear, anger, and the things we cannot control, and what any of that has to say about being alive in 2026.
If this episode made you think of someone who would appreciate 25 minutes on why the mind hides things from itself, share it with them. That is how this show finds the people it is meant for.
Sources and further reading for this episode are in the show notes. Everything we referenced and a few things worth going deeper on are listed there, with brief notes on what each one is useful for.
We are Philosophy for Lunch. New episodes every Sunday.
Big ideas, human conversations, 25 minutes.
See you next week. See you next Sunday.